The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 41. Riff-Raff. While I worked as a barmaid at the Brunswick Arms, I visited my grandparents often. I was very sad when they had to leave Hyde Farm, but the sprawling place that had long since anchored my mum's side of the family had become too expensive to heat in the winter. Besides, my aunt and my cousins had moved to Yorkshire, and 2 of my uncles had moved out. My grandparents, after being on the council's waiting list for a couple of years, were offered a spacious flat in the small village of Bookham, just off the M25, about an hour's drive from Heathrow Airport. My grandmother told me if I got the job at British Airways, I could do my standbys from there. My grandmother still worked to pay the bills, and my grandfather still sat in his armchair all day long and refused to eat anything much, perhaps half a sausage and the yolk of an egg. My rapidly shrinking grandfather's anorexia was obvious to everyone, but no one made much of a fuss about it, even though he weighed no more than a 10-year-old. Whenever I saw him, I always made an effort to talk about the things he wanted to talk about. The bond between us would not have formed otherwise. The only pleasure my grandfather ever got from life came in the form of strong Danish lager, which was where the majority of his calories came from too. He also liked to drink whiskey, which I got for him duty-free. Although I knew I was not helping his health, I regularly bought him Panatellas and Coronas to smoke too. I felt better about making his day happier than leaving him to the deadly monotony he would have endured otherwise. My grandfather liked to tune his radio to the bandwidth that Gatwick's air traffic control tower used. He then liked to tell me if anything dramatic had occurred, aborted landings and the occasional need for emergency services. He also had a fascination with steam trains and all things electrical, and every Christmas he made a huge production of getting the tree lights to work again. Everyone in the family used to groan, but I respected his dedication to preserving the series of ugly plastic lanterns that Noah must have surely used to decorate the Ark. On my 21st birthday, I applied to British Airways as well as Virgin Atlantic Airways, but only for backup. No one thought I would get the job at British Airways, except my grandfather. He was certain I would, and he announced this to all my family, who were sceptical. My mother told me I was too young, and my grandmother said that because I didn't have any A-levels or speak another language, I didn't stand much of a chance. British Airways was the flagship carrier after all, the elite of the elite, the creme de la creme, and they couldn't just hire any old riffraff. Several weeks after submitting the applications, I received a letter from British Airways inviting me for an interview at their headquarters on the perimeter road of Heathrow Airport the following week. I happily sat with a lot of other vivacious girls who, on paper, stood a much better chance than I. The rumour was that there was only 1 spot available for every 500 applicants. I wore a green and black dog-tooth suit and my hair in a low bun. I had practised in my head what I thought those interviewing me would want to hear. I wouldn't mention that I wanted to travel. I would just say I wanted to meet people. I had long since envisioned my desire life playing out in flamboyant detail in my head, and so everything was at stake. This made me nervous. I felt a little phony, but the job meant turning on the charm, whether I felt charming or not. When my name was called, I walked into a room and was offered a chair in front of a panel of 3. Something about the situation felt eerily familiar, but I couldn't think what. A young female recruitment officer held a list of questions, and the young man next to her was writing some notes. The older man was seemingly just an observer. Some of the questions were standard, others were specifically designed to catch the interviewee off guard. I was asked, "If your mother was sitting behind you now, would she think this is the real Sarah speaking?" "Probably not," I said. "I've been lying to her all my life." This made the older man laugh. We got on very well after that, and when the interview was over, he left the room with me. He smelled of cigarettes and I could tell he wanted a puff. On the way to the car park, he told me that I reminded him of his daughter, and then he asked me if I'd heard any good jokes lately. "What do you call a deer with no eyes?" I asked. "Tell me," he responded. "No idea." Again he laughed. A week later, another letter arrived in the post inviting me back for a second interview. This too went well. A few days later I got a phone call from the Human Resource Department offering me a stewardess position. All the long-haul routes for a fleet of Boeing 747s flew out of Heathrow, the shortest flight being 6 hours to Abu Dhabi. Most flights were double that, and the layovers were long because the company had many newly acquired routes that were only served bi-weekly. My training, which would last 6 weeks, was scheduled to begin the following Monday. Several days after that, Virgin Atlantic offered me a job as a stewardess out of Gatwick. I tore that letter up. When I told my mum I had got the job at British Airways, she said, "Did you really? Well done, that's fantastic news. You are bound to meet a handsome pilot." My mum did not like my current boyfriend and thought I could do much better. "He's an oik done well, that's all, Sarah," she said. When I told my grandparents, my grandfather just nodded and smiled smugly for a very long time. My grandmother was shocked, but she was very happy for me. My dad just raised his glass and said, "Durham's the name." Whenever my brother or I achieved something noteworthy, he always attributed it to his bloodline, which compared to my mother's was more impressive. "Never forget, young lady," he said, "you are a direct descendant of William the Conqueror." The uniform I had worn at Dan Air was a great deal more flattering than the uniform British Airways had commissioned Roland Klein to design. His instructions must have been to design a uniform that looked good on all body shapes and sizes, and consequently it wasn't as tight-fitting as I had hoped. The 12-year-old critic inside me was very disappointed. I looked like a granny in grey as I stared aghast in the cheval mirror at my uniform fitting. My winter skirt hung well below my knee, and my blouse, which resembled a stripy deck chair, didn't cling where I would have it cling had I been the designer. The Laker ladies of the 70s wore bright red mini dresses, red high heels and cute little bowler hats. What the hell had happened in the intervening decade? British Airways did not require their stewardesses to wear high heels either, and the fact that hats were only obligatory on flights carrying a member of the royal family was a real blow to me. I loved the gloves, though, which were made of soft navy blue leather with a bright red leather lining. The handbag matched, and so did the cabin bag, which was where we kept our tabards and things like corkscrews and ice picks and spare tights, but it was a clumsy utilitarian holdall that would have made Louis Vuitton wince. I completed my 6 weeks training course, coming last in the class. I should have learned from my Dan Air experience, but I hadn't. To say I was ecstatically relieved that I had scraped through would have been an understatement. But as one of my instructors had said prior to the wing ceremony, "Don't worry about it, Sarah. Someone has to finish first and someone has to finish last." I didn't let it bother me after that. I preferred tortoises over hares anyway. The tedious interpersonal situations I had endured at Dan Air were over with, thank fucking God, I said when I first realised that everyone working for British Airways was relaxed and well adjusted and for the most part reasonable. Unlike Dan Air, British Airways had long since employed male crew members, many openly gay and brilliantly flamboyant. Others were family men who knew how to be kind and nurturing. Others were young and carefree men who just wanted to get laid and have a good time. With the bitchiness and the petty tyrannies of the past almost non-existent, the work environment was stress-free and we all looked out for each other. My first operational flight to Miami was a disaster, however. The first sector of the trip went well, but the following day I fell asleep while sunbathing at the hotel's rooftop pool. By nightfall I had a terrible sunburn and could barely walk. I had not realised that, in spite of cloud cover, the sun's rays were extremely potent, even though I had been warned by several instructors during training. I could not operate the flight home that night because my legs were so swollen. I sat in a first-class seat and after drinking half a bottle of Chateau Margaux slept all the way home. The remainder of the crew picked up the slack and the cabin service director covered for me, but his warning was heartfelt. "You'd better straighten your shit out, Sarah. The company would take a really dim view if they knew about this." I thanked the CSD profusely, and he nodded and wished me all the luck in the world, which he no doubt thought I would need. 6 months later, on a trip to Kuala Lumpur, we met again and we laughed about my mistake. He admitted that he didn't think I would last 3 months. I told him I had my doubts too. His parting words were, "Good seeing you again, Sarah. Nice tan."